In the long dusk of prehistory, before ink preserved memory and before myth learned to clothe itself in monsters, fear already had a familiar shape. It did not stalk the tree lean with glowing eyes, nor did it announce itself with claws or fangs. It sat beside the fire, shared bread, spoke the same language. And when the night grew thin and the hunger grew sharp, it became something else. The earliest human communities lived close to the edge of survival, where the distance between order and chaos was measured not in laws, but in seasons. Poor harvest could undo a village. A harsh winter could unmake generations of knowledge. In these fragile worlds, identity was not fixed. Bent under pressure, cracked under isolation. And when it broke, people searched for words powerful enough to explain what they had witnessed. Long before wolves became symbols, they were competitors. They hunted the same game. They followed the same migratory paths. They watched from the darkness as humans learned to build fire and fence. The relationship was intimate and uneasy. Two species bound by survival, mirroring each other's intelligence, cooperation, and violence. To early humans, the wolf was not alien. It was uncomfortably familiar. Anthropological evidence suggests that many early cultures did not see a strict boundary between human and animal. Identity was fluid, porous, and situational. Hunters wore skins not as costume, but as communion. To move like an animal was to borrow its power. To think like one was to survive. In these belief systems, transformation was not fantasy, it was possibility. But there was a darker mirror beneath this reverence. When a member of the group began to behave in ways that defied social restraint, when rage overcame reason, when hunger erased taboo, when grief hollowed the self, the community faced a threat more terrifying than any predator. Not because it was strong, but because it was human. Archaeological records and early myth fragments hint at stories of men who wandered from settlements and did not return the same. Some were war survivors, fractured by violence. Others were exiles, cut loose from kinship and law. Some were simply starving. In all cases, the transformation was not physical. It was social. The loss of name, of role, of belonging. In small societies, where survival depended on trust, unpredictability was lethal. A man who could not be read, who no longer obeyed ritual or rule, was dangerous not because he was evil, but because he was untethered. Communities did not yet possess the language of psychology or trauma. They understood only that something had slipped. Something had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The wolf became the shape of that fear because it already lived at the margins. It was a creature of intelligence and family, yet capable of sudden violence. It hunted cooperatively as humans did. It protected its own. And when driven by hunger, it could turn ruthless. In the wolf, early societies found a reflection they did not wish to claim. Before the werewolf was a curse, it was an explanation. To say a man had become a wolf was not to accuse him of sprouting fur beneath the moon. It was to declare that he had stepped outside the fragile agreement that made civilization possible. He had abandoned the firelight for the cold logic of survival. He had chosen or been forced into a world without restraint. In ancient Europe, remnants of these beliefs survived in law codes and oral tradition. To be declared wolf-headed, in early Germanic societies was to be stripped of legal protection. One could be hunted, killed, forgotten. The language of transformation masked a deeper truth. Identity was a social contract, and it could be revoked. Psychologically, this fear reveals something enduring. Humans are not most afraid of the unknown. They are afraid of recognition. The man who breaks under hunger, the neighbor who becomes violent under pressure, the self that emerges when rules dissolve. These are reflections too close to ignore. The werewolf was not born in the forest. It was born in moments of collapse. Myth allowed communities to externalize that terror. By naming the transformation, by placing it under the dominion of moon and curse, people could distance themselves from the truth, that under certain conditions anyone could fracture. Anyone could cross the line between restraint and instinct. This is why early werewolf stories lack spectacle. There is no glamour in them. No heroism. Only shame. Isolation. The slow erasure of humanity. To become a wolf was not to gain power. It was to lose language, law, and memory. And yet these stories endured. Because they spoke to something real. The quiet knowledge that civilization is not permanent. That it is built daily, fragile as firelight. That when hunger speaks louder than morality, when exile hollows the soul, the beast we fear is not an intruder, but a possibility. In this earliest chapter of the werewolf myth, there is no full moon. There is no howl. There is only a village watching one of its own drift beyond the reach of understanding, and searching for a story strong enough to contain that loss. The monster had not yet taken shape, but the fear was already human. In the ancient world, the human body was not seen as a closed vessel. It was a threshold, porous, unstable, and vulnerable to influence. Identity did not reside solely in thought or name, but in movement, instinct, and breath. To be human was not to be separate from nature, but suspended within it, constantly negotiating control over forces older than language itself. Beneath ritual and law, early societies understood something modern minds often forget. Civilization is learned. Instinct is inherited. Long before myths spoke of men turning into beasts, people believed the animal already lived within them. Not as a curse but as a necessity. Survival demanded it. The hunter who hesitated starved. The mother who ignored fear lost her child. Aggression, alertness, territorial instinct. These were not sins. They were tools. Across Paleolithic and Neolithic cultures, cave walls and carved stones reveal human figures fused with animal forms. Antlers rise from human skulls. Jaws elongate. Bodies blur. These were not monsters. They were intermediaries. Beings who existed between worlds, embodying the belief that identity could shift according to need. The boundary between human and animal was not fixed. It was situational. To wear the skin of a wolf, a bear, or a stag was not to pretend. It was to participate. Hunters believed that by mimicking the animal, its posture, its rhythm, its patience, they could momentarily borrow its essence. This was not performance. It was transformation through empathy. But what was invoked could also overwhelm. Anthropologists note that societies which rely heavily on hunting often develop myths centered on control, the regulation of instinct. Rituals existed not only to summon the animal spirit, but to send it back. Without these boundaries, the danger was not physical transformation, but psychological dissolution. The loss of the self into impulse. Here the roots of the werewolf deepen. When individuals could no longer contain the animal within, when rage erupted without cause, when violence persisted beyond necessity, when appetite overruled taboo, the community faced a paradox. These people were not possessed by demons. They were overtaken by something intimately human. Something everyone carried but few lost control of. The wolf became symbolic not because it was savage, but because it was disciplined. Wolves kill efficiently. They do not murder. They do not waste. When humans acted with uncontrolled brutality, it was not the wolf they resembled, but a wolf unbound by its own nature. An inversion. Corruption. This is why early werewolf myths are filled with shame rather than triumph. The transformation is not empowering. It is degrading. To become wolfish was to lose mastery over oneself. To be ruled by hunger instead of reason. Ancient Greek writers hinted at this fear. Plato described men who, after tasting forbidden flesh, were cast into lives of predation and exile. The punishment was not physical alteration, but moral exile, a permanent severing from society. The animal beneath the skin had surfaced, and there was no ritual strong enough to push it back down. Psychologically, these myths reveal an early understanding of the divided self. The part that plans, remembers, and obeys law, and the part that reacts, consumes, and survives. Civilization demanded dominance of the former. Myth warned of what happened when the balance collapsed. The werewolf at this stage was not supernatural. It was cautionary, a reminder that restraint is not natural. It is maintained. and that when social structures weaken, when famine, war, or isolation erode the boundaries of identity, the animal does not arrive from outside. Rises. In these early beliefs, there is no moon pulling at blood. No curse spoken by witches. Only the quiet terror that beneath the stories we tell ourselves about progress and order, something older waits patiently. Not to destroy us, but to remind us how thin the skin of humanity truly is. In the ancient imagination, the wolf did not belong solely to darkness. It moved through sacred space as easily as it did through shadow. Long before it became a symbol of curse and corruption, it was woven into the spiritual architecture of early civilizations. An animal both feared and honored, standing at the threshold between chaos and order. To early Europeans, the wolf was not simply a predator. It was a rival intelligence. Hunted with strategy. It lived by hierarchy. It protected its own with ferocity and discipline. In this, humans recognized a reflection that unsettled them. The wolf did not represent mindless savagery, but a parallel society, one that survived without laws, yet never without structure. This duality made the wolf sacred. Across Indo-European myth, wolves appear beside gods of war, death, and transition. They were companions of warriors, escorts of souls, guardians of the liminal spaces between life and death. In Norse belief, wolves ran at the heels of gods, embodying the violence that maintained cosmic balance. In Roman legend, a wolf did not devour the founders of civilization. It nourished them. Rome itself was raised on the milk of a beast. Such stories reveal a truth often forgotten. Ancient societies did not fear violence itself. They feared uncontrolled violence. The wolf, in its natural form, was violent with purpose. It killed to live, not to dominate. That restraint, instinct bound by necessity, made it worthy of reverence. But reverence is fragile. As agricultural societies replaced nomadic ones, the wolf's meaning began to shift. Settled life required predictability. Crops demanded protection. Livestock replaced wild game. The wolf, once a competitor, became a threat to stability. Sacred symbols rarely survive unchanged when economies evolve. Yet even as the wolf was pushed from the center of belief toward the margins, it retained its spiritual gravity. It became a creature of boundaries, haunting forests, mountains, and winter roads, places where civilization thinned, and old rules weakened. To encounter a wolf was to be reminded that beyond the village fence, another order still ruled. This is where the werewolf began to take form, not as monster but as sacrilege. To merge human identity with the wolf was no longer a sacred act. It became a violation, a collapse of carefully maintained boundaries. If the wolf represented disciplined instinct, then the man who became wolf-like without restraint represented imbalance. The sacred turned profane. Religious transformations accelerated this shift. As Christianity spread across Europe, older animal reverence was recast as pagan error. Sacred wolves became demonic. Guardian figures became tempters. The wilderness itself was no longer neutral. It was fallen. And creatures that thrived there inherited that judgment. The wolf was no longer a teacher. It became a warning. Yet beneath this moral reframing, the old understanding lingered. People still sensed that the wolf was not evil by nature. What frightened them was proximity. The closeness between wolf behavior and human behavior under strain. The knowledge that the difference between guardian and predator was not species, but circumstance. This tension settled into folklore. Stories of men who wore wolf skins, not to honor the animal, but to abandon their humanity. Warriors who invoked wolf spirits to erase fear before battle, risking never fully returning. The sacred power remained, but it demanded a cost. Anthropologically, this marks a turning point. When a culture begins to demonize what it once revered, it reveals anxiety about losing control over forces it no longer understands. The werewolf emerged from this anxiety, a symbol of sacred instinct gone unchecked. In this chapter of the myth, the wolf is not yet a curse. It is a reminder. that the sacred and the dangerous are often the same thing, and that when reverence fades, fear takes its place. In the oldest layers of myth, transformation was never accidental. It was summoned, chosen, endured. Before the werewolf became a figure of helpless curse, it was shaped through ritual, through acts meant to fracture the self and remake it into something capable of surviving a hostile world. Ancient societies understood that identity could be altered through ceremony. To cross a threshold, into adulthood, warfare, exile, or death, one had to be broken down before being reassembled. Ritual was the language of that breaking. And within it, the idea of becoming animal carried both power and danger. Among early Indo-European warrior cults, young men were often removed from society and sent into the wilderness. There, stripped of name, family, and protection, they were forced to endure hunger, cold, and fear. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests these initiates wore animal skins, lived by hunting alone, and learned to move silently through forests like predators. They were not pretending to be wolves. They were unlearning how to be human. These rites served a purpose. Civilization required violence to defend itself, but it could not allow that violence to remain within its walls. The warrior had to be shaped by savagery, then purified of it. Ritual allowed the community to summon the beast temporarily, then cage it again. But rituals fail. When an initiate did not return properly, when the isolation lingered, when the feral mindset refused to dissolve, the transformation became permanent in the eyes of the community. The man was no longer a guardian. He was a threat. The language of ritual gave way to the language of myth. He had become something else. Blood plays a recurring role in these stories, not as spectacle, but as symbol. Blood marked the crossing of boundaries, between life and death, kin and stranger, human and animal. To spill blood outside ritual context was taboo. To consume it was worse. Such acts signaled a collapse of social order, a rejection of restraint. Myth preserved this collapse as transformation. In later folklore, these ideas crystallized into stories of oaths spoken beneath trees, of belts made from wolf hide, of salves rubbed into skin to invite change. These were not magical inventions, but symbolic remnants, ritual memories passed down after their original meaning was lost. The curse replaced the ceremony. Anthropologically, this reflects a deep fear of liminality. People who exist between categories, between citizen and exile, soldier and civilian, human and animal, unsettle stable societies. They cannot be easily named. And what cannot be named becomes monstrous. Psychologically, these rituals reveal an early understanding of dissociation. Extreme conditions can fracture identity. Hunger narrows thought. Isolation erodes empathy. Violence reshapes perception. The self that emerges is not possessed, but altered. Ritual acknowledged this danger, even as it risked invoking it. The werewolf, in this context, is not born under a moon. He is forged through abandonment. To be invited into transformation was not a gift. It was a burden few could carry without losing themselves. And when they did, the community responded not with compassion, but with myth, turning failure into curse, trauma into legend. Over time, the memory of ritual faded. What remained was fear. Stories no longer spoke of trials endured for the good of the group, but of men seduced by power, corrupted by animal desire. The responsibility shifted from society to the individual. The curse became moral. Yet beneath these later interpretations, the older truth remains visible. Transformation was once a controlled descent into darkness, meant to serve the light. And the werewolf stands as a warning of what happens when descent has no return. Not every threshold is meant to be crossed twice. As medieval Europe hardened into fields, walls, and laws, the wilderness became more than a place. It became a moral accusation. To live outside the village was no longer a necessity of survival, but a rejection of order. Forests, once sacred and sustaining, were reimagined as spaces of lawlessness where humanity thinned and something older waited to reclaim it. In this world, identity was defined by proximity to authority. A man was human because he belonged, to land, to lord, to church. Those who did not fit neatly within these structures became suspect. Hermits, beggars, deserters, and the mentally unwell existed in a dangerous gray space. They were not criminals by deed alone, but by condition. Their lives resisted classification, and so they invited fear. Legal records from early medieval Europe reveal a chilling truth. To be declared an outlaw was to be stripped of humanity. In Anglo-Saxon law, the wolf-hefed, the wolf's head, marked a person outside protection. Anyone could kill them without consequence. The language was not metaphorical. To be outside the law was to become prey. The wolf, already feared as a destroyer of livestock and livelihoods, became the perfect symbol for social exclusion. It lived beyond fences. It obeyed no king. It survived without permission. In a society built on obedience, this independence was unforgivable. Folklore absorbed legal reality. Stories began to circulate of men who fled into forests and returned changed, not by magic but by necessity. Hunger sharpened their instincts. Isolation stripped away manners. Violence became a tool rather than a taboo. To villagers watching from behind walls, these men no longer seemed human. The myth followed perception. This is where the werewolf transforms from ritual failure into criminal myth. Not a cursed innocent, but a willful transgressor. A man who chose wildness over civilization. The narrative justified punishment. If he was a beast, then hunting him was not murder. It was order restoring itself. Psychologically, this reflects a deep discomfort with marginal lives. Societies depend on predictable roles. Those who cannot conform threaten not stability but meaning. The werewolf became a story told to reassure the settled that chaos lived elsewhere, beyond the treeline, beyond the law. Yet the irony remains. Many accused of living wild were not rebels, but casualties of circumstance. Famine drove people from land. War shattered families. Illness isolated minds. Exile was often imposed, not chosen. The myth erased these truths, replacing them with fur and fangs. By the late Middle Ages, sermons and chronicles spoke of werewolves not as victims of ritual or trauma, but as warnings. To abandon social order was to lose one's soul. The forest was no longer neutral. It was fallen. And so the werewolf became a crime made flesh, a reminder carved into story and law that humanity was conditional. To live among wolves was to become one. And once named as such, there was no return to the firelight. In a world without medicine, the mind was a mystery feared more than the dark. When reason fractured and behavior slipped beyond explanation, societies reached not for diagnosis, but for myth. Madness was not invisible, it was embodied. And the body it chose was often that of the wolf. Medieval and early modern Europe lacked the language to describe psychological collapse. There were no terms for dissociation, psychosis, or trauma. What existed instead were signs. Men who claimed to be animals, who roamed at night, who rejected clothing, speech, and kin. People who no longer recognized themselves, or were no longer recognized by others. Physicians recorded such cases with unease. Some wrote of patients convinced their limbs were furred, their teeth sharpened, their hunger uncontrollable. They did not speak of fantasy, but of certainty. The sufferers were not pretending. They believed they had crossed a threshold and could not return. This condition came to be known as lycanthropy, not as folklore but as illness. Ancient Greek medical texts describe it as a form of melancholy, marked by insomnia, paranoia, and withdrawal from society. The afflicted wandered graveyards and forests, avoiding human contact, compelled by an urge they could not name. But knowledge alone did not bring compassion. To communities already strained by famine, disease, and religious anxiety, such individuals represented danger, not because they were violent, but because they were unpredictable. A man who no longer obeyed shared reality threatened the fragile agreement that held society together. So the mind was given fur. Calling madness a transformation into a beast made it comprehensible. It imposed narrative on chaos. The sufferer was no longer ill. He was cursed. No longer broken, he was monstrous. This shift absolved communities of responsibility. If the wolf was to blame, no healing was required. Trial records from the late Middle Ages reveal how often mental illness became criminalized through myth. Confessions of turning were extracted under pressure, reinforced by expectation. Once a man believed he was a beast, every action confirmed it. Silence became savagery. Fear became proof. Psychologically, this was a tragedy compounded by belief. The label shaped behavior. Isolation deepened delusion. Punishment replaced care. The myth did not describe the illness, it intensified it. Religious authorities interpreted these states as spiritual failure. The loss of reason was seen as evidence of sin or possession. The animal within was framed not as instinct or illness, but as moral collapse. Salvation, not treatment, was prescribed. And when salvation failed, execution followed. Yet beneath the cruelty lies an uncomfortable insight. These stories reveal an early awareness that identity is fragile, that the self can fracture under pressure, that sanity is not guaranteed, it is maintained. The werewolf of madness was not feared for strength, but for collapse. He represented the terror that reason itself could dissolve, that the boundary between human and animal was not physical, but mental, and therefore vulnerable. Unlike other monsters, this werewolf did not hunt villages. He wandered alone. He avoided light. He was consumed by inner certainty rather than external violence. His tragedy was not what he did, but what he believed himself to be. In time, science would reclaim these stories. Psychiatry would rename the condition. But the myth endured because it spoke to something deeper than diagnosis. It spoke to the fear that the mind, once unmoored, could carry us somewhere we cannot follow back. And so madness was given claws, not because it had them, but because society needed distance from its reflection. The wolf was not outside the man. It was the name given when understanding failed. By the early modern era, fear no longer whispered from the forest alone, it spoke from the courtroom. Europe had learned to give its anxieties structure, ritual, and law. And in doing so, it placed the werewolf on trial, not as myth, but as evidence that humanity itself could fracture beyond repair. Werewolf trials followed the same dark rhythm as witch persecutions. They surged during periods of instability, failed harvests, religious schism, war, and plague. When the world felt ungovernable, societies searched for bodies to anchor their fear. The werewolf offered a convenient shape, human enough to blame, monstrous enough to destroy. Unlike witches, the accused were almost always men. Often they were shepherds, soldiers, loners, or the poor, people already living at the margins. Their crime was not transformation but difference. They were known to wander, to speak strangely, to resist authority, or to survive in ways that unsettled their neighbors. Court records from France, Germany, and the Baltic regions reveal a chilling consistency. The accusations rarely began with violence. They began with rumor, with sightings, with unease. A man seen near livestock deaths. A figure moving through fields at night. A presence that felt wrong. Evidence followed expectation. Confessions, once obtained, were shaped by belief. Under torture, the accused described wearing wolf skins, swearing oaths to dark forces, running on all fours through moonlit forests. These narratives were not spontaneous inventions. They were cultural scripts. The trials did not uncover truth. They performed it. To the authorities, the werewolf represented a collapse of hierarchy, a being that rejected God, law, and human form simultaneously. In theological terms, it was heresy made flesh. In legal terms, it was treason against the social order. The execution was not punishment. It was purification. Psychologically, the trials reveal a society terrified of ambiguity. The werewolf occupied a space between categories. Neither fully criminal nor fully insane, neither animal nor man. Such liminal figures destabilized systems built on clear definitions. The response was annihilation. What makes these trials especially haunting is their sincerity. Judges believed they were protecting their communities. Clergy believed they were saving souls. The accused, broken by isolation and fear, often came to believe the story themselves. Identity dissolved under repetition. In some cases, the accused admitted they could not remember their crimes. In others, they claimed to awaken with bloodied hands and no recollection. Modern psychology recognizes dissociation in these accounts, episodes born of trauma, stress, or mental illness. But the courts recognized only guilt. The werewolf trials were not about beasts. They were about control. They asserted that humanity was fragile, conditional, and revocable, that one could be unmade by belief alone. The body burned at the stake was less important than the warning its destruction sent. Remain legible, remain obedient, remain human. When the trials faded, they left little closure. No monster was truly slain. No fear resolved. The forests grew quiet, but the anxiety endured. Simply changed language. The werewolf retreated from law and into story. From execution records into folklore. From courtrooms into fireside warnings. But the memory remained, that once, not long ago, a man could be tried not for what he had done, but for what others feared he might become. And in that memory, the werewolf still stands half human, half reflection, a reminder of what happens when fear is given the authority to judge identity itself. When the land failed, the stories changed. Across medieval Europe, famine arrived not as a single catastrophe, but as a slow erasure. Crops withered. Livestock vanished. Winters stretched longer than memory allowed. Hunger hollowed villages from the inside, reducing once ordered lives to instinct and endurance. And in these seasons of scarcity, the werewolf returned, not as legend but as explanation. Starvation alters the body, but it devastates the mind. Contemporary chronicles describe people growing restless, sleepless, prone to sudden rage or despair. Social bonds weakened as survival narrowed perception. Acts once unthinkable crept closer to possibility. In such conditions, moral certainty became a luxury few could afford. Medieval observers did not understand starvation as a psychological force. They understood it as temptation, as punishment, as evidence that something had gone wrong, not just with the land but with the people upon it. When desperation drove individuals to theft, violence, or worse, the community searched for a narrative that preserved its sense of order. The wolf provided that narrative. Folklore from famine-stricken regions is filled with stories of men who prowled the outskirts of villages, stealing food, attacking animals, sometimes even other people. Whether these tales were exaggerated, symbolic, or tragically real mattered little. Hunger stripped away social identity, and myth rushed in to replace it. Cannibalism, when it occurred, was never spoken of plainly. It was unspeakable, not because it was rare, but because it collapsed the final boundary between survival and monstrosity. To eat human flesh was to abandon the shared fiction of humanity itself. And so these acts were displaced onto the werewolf, a figure already burdened with transgression. Chronicles speak of wolf men during times of famine, their appearances rising alongside crop failure. This correlation was not coincidence. The werewolf became a vessel for collective denial. It allowed communities to externalize the horror of what hunger could compel ordinary people to do. Psychologically, famine-induced behavior mirrors what myth encoded. Extreme hunger can cause hallucinations, paranoia, aggression, and moral disintegration. The mind fixates. Empathy recedes. Identity fractures under biological pressure. To medieval eyes, this looked like possession, like transformation. The beast was not summoned by moonlight, but by emptiness. Importantly, these stories rarely place the werewolf at the center of society. He lingers at edges, roads, forests, abandoned fields. He is seen stealing, scavenging, consuming without restraint. He represents survival without dignity, life stripped to its most animal logic. And yet, the werewolf of famine is not triumphant. He is pitted as often as feared. Ballads and regional tales describe him as cursed, trapped in endless hunger, unable to be satisfied. This reflects an uncomfortable empathy, the recognition that starvation makes monsters of us all. Authorities, however, showed less mercy. During famines, punishment intensified. Theft became capital crime. Accusations of monstrosity justified brutality. Executing the beast reassured the living that order still existed, that hunger had not dissolved morality entirely. But the truth lingered beneath the violence. The werewolf did not cause famine. It revealed it. In these chapters of the myth, transformation is not chosen, nor ritually invoked. It is forced by circumstance. Identity collapses under pressure. The beast emerges not because the person is evil, but because survival demands it. This is why famine legends feel different from witch trials or ritual myths. They are quieter. The monster does not roar. He starves. And in that starvation, medieval societies glimpsed a truth too dangerous to name outright. That civilization is sustained not by virtue alone, but by abundance. Remove food, warmth, and security, and the line between human and animal thins rapidly. So the werewolf haunted years of hunger as a warning written in fur and bone. Not that monsters lurk among us, but that, under the weight of famine, we may become what we fear. By the time the werewolf had stalked centuries of folklore, it was no longer merely a story of transformation, hunger, or ritual. It became a mirror, a reflection not of the forest, nor of wolves, nor even of curses cast by witches, but of the human self fractured by its own instincts. The terror of the werewolf was never only outward. It was inward, staring back at the one who believed themselves whole. In medieval chronicles, the curse is often described as an inevitability. Once bitten, once initiated, once marked by moonlight or sin, the individual awakens to a life they cannot recall. The transformation is not always physical. Sometimes the claws are in the mind, the fur in memory, the howl in conscience. Victims speak of waking to deeds they do not remember committing, of returning to their villages with a faint trace of teeth, blood, or fur upon their hands and clothing. Identity itself becomes unstable. What was once self now exists only in fragments, each one suspect, each one feared. The mirror of the werewolf is psychological as much as it is mythical. Scholars of lycanthropy note that the delusion of transformation often coincides with guilt, trauma, or dissociation. In a world without psychiatry, without terms for internal fracture, the manifestation of mental instability had to be externalized. To believe oneself a wolf was not simply a symptom. It was a story, a metaphor, a framework for understanding the unexplainable. The wolf in the mirror allowed people to name their fear, to give shape to the things within themselves they could not confront directly. Anger, appetite, violence, and shame. It is here, in the mirror, that the werewolf myth becomes most haunting. For unlike other monsters, it is not defeated by light, fire, or faith alone. The curse persists because it is not wholly outside the individual. It is a reflection, one that exists whenever self-control falters, whenever hunger, rage, or grief threaten to unmoor reason. Even in daylight, even among kin, the awareness of what one might become lingers like a shadow just beyond the edge of vision. European folklore emphasizes this duality. Tales describe men and women who once appeared entirely human, who walked among neighbors, who loved families, prayed in chapels and tilled fields. And yet, beneath the surface, the animal waits. Some legends tell of villagers discovering stolen livestock, of bodies mauled under the moon, or of neighbors confessing under duress. These stories always stress one detail. The transformation is involuntary, a punishment or consequence, rather than an act of malice. The curse is not about power. It is about recognition. The werewolf forces the afflicted, and the community, to confront the precarious boundary between civilization and instinct. The mirror extends beyond individual identity. It reflects society itself. Communities, villages, and even kingdoms saw in the werewolf the potential for collapse. If one man could become a beast, then under the right pressure, famine, war, disease, anyone could. The myth is a warning not just to the accused but to those who watched. maintain law, maintain ritual, maintain restraint, or risk the dissolution of everything you believe makes you human. Psychologically, this is profound. The werewolf is never purely externalized. It embodies self-awareness and guilt. It asks uncomfortable questions. How close am I to losing control? How much of my morality is fragile, circumstantial? How thin is the veneer that separates my reason from instinct? It is a curse not of limbs and teeth, but of memory and conscience. And so the werewolf, in the chapter of the mirror, teaches that the true horror lies not in being hunted by neighbors or clergy, not in howling under a cursed moon, but in recognizing oneself in that monster. The curse persists because it is never truly removed. It waits quietly in the reflection, in every shadow of hesitation, in every pang of guilt, in every moment when survival tempts instinct over reason. The monster is never outside. It is the self, unbound, staring back from the glass. As the werewolf myth deepened, it came to dwell not only in forests or the fevered minds of the afflicted, but in the moral imagination of Europe itself. Faith reshaped the creature, recasting instinct and identity as spiritual failure. The wolf was no longer merely animal, ritual, or symptom. It became a symbol of sin, a warning that the flesh could betray the soul, and that reason alone was insufficient to keep humanity whole. Christian doctrine imposed a rigid order upon a world that had always been uncertain. Old boundaries blurred by ritual, necessity, and instinct were replaced by rules of heaven and earth. The wolf, once a creature of sacred liminality and disciplined instinct, became evidence of disobedience. Transformation into a beast was interpreted as rebellion, not against the village, not against law, but against God himself. It was heresy made manifest in fur and teeth. Sermons, penitentials, and chronicles reinforced this worldview. Clerics described the werewolf as an outward sign of internal corruption. A man who gave in to appetite, rage, or desire had abandoned his divine purpose, and the flesh now mirrored the spiritual decay. These stories offered comfort and fear in equal measure. The faithful were reassured that obedience maintained order, while the sinner was warned that temptation could not remain hidden. Even the most human impulse, hunger, anger, grief, was suspect. Faith extended its control not only over the myth but over reality. Werewolf trials of the 15th and 16th centuries often involved clergy in roles of interrogator and judge. Confessions extracted under pressure were framed in the language of sin. The accused were not only criminal, they were spiritually deficient. To be a wolf was to have abandoned God's light, allowing the beast within to seize dominion. Execution, when it came, was as much sacrament as punishment, an act of purification intended to restore cosmic balance. Yet even as religion imposed meaning, it acknowledged a fundamental truth. The beast arises from human nature itself. Clerics often noted that a man did not become a wolf by choice, but by succumbing to impulses the church could not fully contain. Lust, gluttony, violence, despair. Faith against the flesh, then, was not merely moral instruction. It was a recognition of the fragile tether between civilization and instinct. Civilization, in this view, was a gift fragile as glass, and the wolf existed to remind humanity of that precariousness. This tension created the enduring horror of the werewolf. It is not a creature one can flee from or kill and thus be safe. The threat exists inside, in every man and woman who feels hunger, fear, or rage. The myth, reinforced by faith, externalizes what is most intimate, the internal struggle between the pull of instinct and the discipline of belief. Anthropologically, the Church's framing of the werewolf is a remarkable synthesis of law, morality, and psychology. By naming transformation as sin, society found a mechanism to govern both behavior and imagination. The wolf became an instrument of control, a tool for reinforcing hierarchy and obedience. Yet it also preserved an older truth, that humanity is never fully in command of itself, and that instinct, when left unchecked, can devour identity. Even in folklore, the conflict persists. Stories describe pious men and women who resisted the curse, yet trembled with self-doubt, fearing that one misstep might awaken the beast within. It was a lesson in vigilance, a reminder that faith must continually guard the self against its own nature. And so, in this chapter, the werewolf is no longer simply a figure of superstition. He is a mirror of the soul, a cautionary emblem of the eternal struggle between the divine and the mortal. The creature's claws are not only teeth and nails, they are the pull of desire, the lure of hunger, the shadow of instinct that faith must constantly restrain. The monster is never far. It waits in every choice, every temptation, every moment when the flesh whispers louder than the spirit. And the faithful learn, as they always have, that salvation depends not only on belief, but on restraint, and that the line between man and beast is measured in conscience as much as in blood. Long before fear replaced reverence, the wolf was not a curse but a guardian. In the earliest myths of Europe, it stood at the margins of human life, a protector of thresholds, a companion of warriors, a guide of the dead. It patrolled forests and mountains not as predator, but as enforcer of balance. Sacred and disciplined, it embodied the power to survive without domination, to exist in harmony with instinct rather than outside it. Across the pagan world, wolves were intertwined with gods and heroes. In Norse cosmology, they ran alongside Odin, tearing through the cosmos yet bound by their roles in the divine order. In Roman legend, a she-wolf nurtured the founders of a civilization, offering life and strength where human care could not reach. Even among Celtic and Slavic peoples, wolves were seen as psychopomps, mediators between worlds, and symbols of courage and loyalty. To revere the wolf was to recognize the wildness within and without, the disciplined chaos that sustains life as much as it threatens it. But as Christianity spread, sacred wolves became dangerous memories. Pagan beliefs were recast as heresy. Guardians became demons. Companions became predators. The forest, once neutral or sacred, was now a space of moral ambiguity and spiritual peril. Legends of humans and wolves living in symbiosis were replaced by cautionary tales of transformation and punishment. Reverence gave way to suspicion, and the wolf's disciplined instinct was twisted into a mirror of human sin. This transformation reflects more than religion. It is a window into human psychology and societal control. Communities that once depended on ritualized respect for predators now faced centralized authority: king, church, and law. The autonomy the wolf once symbolized was no longer tolerable. A creature that acted according to instinct, yet with purpose and order, became an uncomfortable mirror. If a wolf could live according to its nature, why could not a man? And if a man did, what threat would that pose to hierarchy and law? Stories of werewolves in this period reflect this anxiety. Tales no longer depict men who honor the wolf or borrow its discipline. Instead, they show humans consumed by animal desire, abandoning villages, families, and morality. The myth becomes moralistic. The wolf within is a punishment, a curse for failing to conform, a reminder that straying from civilization leads inevitably to degradation. Once guardian, now pariah, the wolf reflects humanity's fear of autonomy and unrestrained instinct. Even as fear replaced reverence, traces of the older understanding persisted. Folk tales still hint at respect for the power of the animal, acknowledging its intelligence, strategy, and loyalty. In some regions, the werewolf is not wholly evil. He is tragic, pitiful, and sometimes noble. These remnants suggest that deep down, communities remembered that the wolf was never a monster. It was a mirror, a teacher, and a guide, qualities corrupted only when fear rewrote the story. Anthropologically, the shift from guardian to pariah marks a turning point in human belief. Sacredness becomes sin, instinct becomes transgression, and reverence becomes terror. The wolf's transformation mirrors society itself, reflecting anxieties about control, obedience, and the boundaries between wildness and civilization. By the end of the Middle Ages, the werewolf had assumed its dual identity. It was monster and mirror, criminal and caution, creature and reflection of human frailty. The sacred instincts that once protected and guided became evidence of guilt, a symbol of what happens when autonomy defies authority. And yet, in the shadow of that transformation, the original truth endures. The wolf was never wholly lost. It waits at the edge of myth, reminding us that fear may rewrite reverence, but it cannot erase the memory of what once protected and inspired us. In this chapter, the wolf is neither fully beast nor fully man. It is a guardian cast out, a reflection of what humans feared to see in themselves, and a silent testament to the fragility of memory, belief, and balance. Even as the centuries turned, and Europe transformed through enlightenment, industry, and empire, the werewolf did not vanish. It receded from law courts, from trial records, from the pages of clerics' sermons, but it did not disappear. It lingered in the mind, in folklore, in the shadow of human memory, persisting as a symbol of the fractures that civilization can never fully repair. By the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars and physicians began to reinterpret the myth. Lycanthropy became a clinical term, not a curse. Madness and dissociation were distinguished from witchcraft and sin. Modern psychology traced the patterns once interpreted as transformation: dissociation, trauma, psychosis, and compulsion. The wolf was no longer hunted in the forest, but studied in the human mind. And yet, the fascination persisted. The myth had encoded truths too profound to vanish with reason: that identity is fragile, that instinct can overtake intellect, that the human mind is capable of violence it cannot comprehend. The werewolf survived in stories that embraced its psychological resonance. Gothic literature, folk tales, and later cinema reimagined the creature not as a distant pagan relic, but as a reflection of our own divided selves. The transformation was not merely physical. It was moral, emotional, and existential. In novels and films, the wolf represents the shadow, the part of human nature that hungers, rages, desires, and fears beyond the bounds of reason. This modern reinvention of the werewolf is telling. It reflects the enduring anxiety that humans are only superficially civilized. The beast is never wholly external. It lurks in memory, in instinct, in conscience. Civilizations change, laws evolve, and medicine advances, but the tension between order and instinct remains. Human history, like the myth, teaches that restraint is fragile, and that even the most ordinary lives are capable of transformation when pressure becomes unbearable. Interestingly, contemporary cases of clinical lycanthropy are rare, but they persist, reminding us that folklore often encodes real truths. The belief in transformation may be rare, but the psychological states that inspired it, alienation, trauma, moral confusion, and the collapse of identity, remain. The werewolf, in this sense, is not anachronistic. It is timeless. It lives wherever identity fractures, wherever instinct overrules reason, wherever society fears the unpredictable human within. The persistence of the myth also speaks to memory. Communities may abandon belief in literal wolves, but they do not abandon the metaphor. Children are warned of monsters that live at the edges of the woods. Adults tell cautionary tales of people driven by appetite or rage, and writers and filmmakers continue to explore the duality that haunted medieval minds. The werewolf is never dead. It is remembered, reinterpreted, and resurrected in every reflection of the self we do not fully recognize. And in that remembering lies its quiet power. The werewolf is more than story or diagnosis. It is a lens through which humanity examines itself, tracing the thin boundary between order and chaos, morality and desire, human and animal. Modern minds may not fear the beast outside the door, but they still tremble before the beast within. The werewolf endures, not as creature, but as consciousness. It waits in every pang of guilt, in every moment of instinct overriding reason, in every fractured identity that questions who it truly is. And in that waiting, it reminds us that the human mind has always been its own wilderness, vast, untamed, and capable of becoming what it fears most. By the close of this long journey through myth, fear, and history, the werewolf has become something more than monster or curse. It has become a mirror, reflecting humanity's deepest vulnerabilities and its capacity for self-understanding. Across centuries, the figure has shifted, from sacred guardian to hunted pariah, from embodiment of madness to moral warning. Yet through every transformation, it has preserved a single truth: the boundaries of identity are fragile, and the self is never wholly secure. In the earliest villages, the fear of the beast was a fear of ourselves. In ritual, it was a disciplined engagement with instinct, a careful negotiation between human and animal. In famine and exile, it was a recognition of how quickly circumstance can unmake order and morality. In trials and sermons, it became the language through which society attempted to contain chaos, to define humanity by its opposite. And in the modern mind, the werewolf endures as metaphor, as caution, and as psychological mirror. Yet in every iteration, there is a thread of redemption. The werewolf is tragic, not evil. It is victim, not villain. Its horror lies not in malice, but in loss, the loss of self, of control, of recognition. Stories remind us that those who become the beast are often responding to pressures beyond their making. Hunger, trauma, grief, or the sheer impossibility of survival in a harsh world. The curse is not punishment. It is revelation. It shows the consequences of a fragile identity pressed to its limits, and the cost of living in a world that cannot fully comprehend the human mind. This duality, horror and empathy, is what has allowed the myth to endure. The werewolf teaches that monstrosity is not an external force imposed upon humanity, but a reflection of what exists within each of us. Anger, hunger, desire, and despair are universal. The difference between man and beast is rarely anatomy. It is circumstance, self-control, and the social contract that binds us together. When those bonds fail, the beast emerges. The myth does not condemn, it warns, illuminates, and in its quiet way, offers understanding. Modern interpretations have embraced this complexity. Literature, cinema, and psychology reinterpret the werewolf as a figure of transformation that can be both terrifying and redemptive. The beast is internalized, examined, and empathized with. Its howl becomes a lament rather than a threat, its hunger a symbol of human vulnerability, its fur the outer manifestation of struggles familiar to all, the fight between reason and instinct, morality and survival. In every retelling, the story asks the same question. Who are we when the masks we wear and the rules we obey fall away? In the end, the werewolf's redemption lies in reflection. The myth survives because it confronts the parts of ourselves we cannot ignore, the instincts we try to control, the impulses we try to hide, the fragility of identity under stress. It is a cautionary tale, a psychological case study, and a mirror held up to the human heart. And so, as the moon rises over forests, villages, and modern cities alike, the werewolf waits. Not to hunt, not to terrify, but to remind us of what we are capable of when the self falters, and to show that even in our darkest moments, awareness and empathy can guide us back. The curse, ultimately, is not in becoming the beast. It is in forgetting that the beast has always been a part of us, and that to recognize it is the first step toward reclaiming the humanity we thought we lost.